Thank you, Dikran. My name is Levon Chorbajian. I'm a writer, editor, translator, lecturer, and a professor of sociology. I'm very happy to have you here today with us to culminate what I think has been a really exciting and significant event here over 2 days in New York City. What we're going to do is each of the panelists is going to make a brief comment and statement, and then we'd like to open this up to the floor and hear from you your questions, your comments, your reactions, and have a real dialogue here among the people here in this room. To my right is Robert Fisk, longtime Middle East correspondent for the British daily The Independent. Mr. Fisk is the author of 4 books, 2 books on the Irish question, and more recently a revised edition of his book Pity the Nation, which is probably the best book available in English on the Lebanese Civil War, and his most recent book, The Great War for Civilization. Mr. Fisk is one of the leading journalists on the issue of the Middle East, and he's a very courageous journalist, not only in the risks that he takes to get stories, but in what he's willing to write. He not only uses the forbidden 12-letter word in the English language, Palestinians, but he uses that word with compassion, understanding, care, and fairness, which is something we can only hope for from most journalists and hardly ever get. So I think it's a real treat to have Mr. Fisk with us. To Mr. Fisk's right is David Barsamian. David is based in Boulder, Colorado. He's the founder of Alternative Radio, a syndicated column in many cities in the United States, although banned in Boston, unfortunately, so I don't get to hear him. He does interviews with vital and important commentators on U.S. foreign policy and other important issues. He's done, I believe, 3, possibly more books with Noam Chomsky. He's also worked with the late Edward Said, and he has a book with Tariq Ali, the very incisive Pakistani political activist and commentator. So I'll begin by making a few comments about my research that have to do with the way in which academics and media people treat the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. When Nagorno-Karabakh burst onto the world scene in 1988, the mass media, including very prominent publications like the New York Times, started printing things that were, I think, not sympathetic to the Armenians and the Armenian case for Nagorno-Karabakh, and in some cases things that were outright untrue, simple fabrications that indicated an anti-Armenian bias in the media coverage. Some examples are, for example, that when the Karabakhis were attempting to reunite with Armenia, the media was reporting that there was simply no precedent for border changes within the Soviet Union. But what about the Crimea, which was turned back from the Russian Republic to the Ukraine in 1954? And it turns out that there were dozens of border changes within the history of the Soviet Union. The media also reported that the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, when it reached a military stage, was a case of senseless ethnic violence. What about issues of self-determination and political justice and the history of the genocide and the fact that the Karabakh struggle is a continuation of events that go back to 1918, 1919, and 1920? The media also reported that Armenians possess a powerful lobby here in the United States that predisposes the United States government to take pro-Armenian positions with regard to this issue and other issues like genocide recognition. Well, we do have a lobby, and it does have its successes, but if we had a really powerful lobby, as reported in the mass media, we wouldn't have problems like the U.S. government opposing genocide recognition resolutions. We would have more support from the U.S. government over the Karabakh struggle. So when they don't like you and they're predisposed against you, they'll make charges against you and make it look like, you know, you're being unfair because you have this powerful lobby and you're going against the poor, victimized Azeris who presumably have no powerful lobby, although Turkey is their ally and they're pretty powerful in Washington, as I think you all know. So this is another way of twisting and distorting the issue and struggle over Nagorno-Karabakh. Another frequent media claim is that Armenian forces occupy 20% of the population of Azerbaijan. It only approaches 20% when you include Karabakh. But we don't view Karabakh as Azeri territory. We view it as Armenian territory. And the claim is a very strong one. The three standards in international law that are used to judge such cases are: what is the history of the territory and who has lived there in the past? What do the people who live there want now? And the issue of self-determination. The media said that the Karabakh conflict was a conflict between the rights of self-determination and the territorial integrity of states. And they pronounced that the territorial integrity of states should have always primacy. Well, that's not written anywhere in international law, but it serves their purpose, and that's what makes its way into the media. One question that I think we might discuss here is why has Armenia on the genocide issue and the Nagorno-Karabakh issue received biased treatment in the mass media, and what could we as Armenian activists do about it? So I'll throw that out there to you. Mr. Fisk.
I'm going to avoid Nagorno-Karabakh, partly because I was there covering that war. And what struck me very much at the time, and you're not going to like this, Levon, is the fact that, we had, and I had always portrayed the Armenian people as being victims, of course, primarily of what I call in my book the first Holocaust of the last century. I found a very supremacist group of Armenians fighting for Nagorno-Karabakh, a pretty unforgiving group. I was quite shocked at the degree of hostility they openly expressed towards the Azeris and towards anyone who didn't agree with them. I was very struck too during the Nagorno-Karabakh war by the fact that every time I went to an artillery battery, it appeared to be commanded by a Lebanese army officer of Armenian extraction. Indeed, I wasn't surprised to find this, since the commander of the Lebanese army at that time was, of course, General Emil Lahoud, who is half Armenian. Indeed, I found an awful lot of Armenian Lebanese army officers in Karabakh in charge of artillery batteries. Sometime later, when I was actually in Lebanon, I was directed to an Armenian chapel up on the hillside above Kesrouan. And an annex to it was an office with a vast number of maps and radio and telephone links to Karabakh, where off-duty Lebanese officers were actually plotting artillery trajectories and giving advice to the batteries in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I must say that my sort of traditional historical view of the Armenian people was not greatly increased in sympathy by my experiences in Nagorno-Karabakh, although I do remember seeing a vast number of Armenian victims of Azeri ethnic cleansing arriving in Stepanakert with no future and all saying, surely the international community will help us, which is what I've heard, of course, from Iranian refugees and Iraqi refugees and Palestinian refugees. And, of course, the international community did not help the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and still, frankly, doesn't do so very much at the moment. I'm sorry that I'm saying things that perhaps you would prefer not to hear. But I certainly was left with a different image of Armenia after covering the Nagorno-Karabakh war for almost a month than I had of Armenians before that. but I appreciate entirely that that particular war is not a continuation of the genocide of 1915. It's a quite different issue. It involves the Bolshevik Revolution and so on and so forth. David.
Thank you. Parev says, it's wonderful to be in New York and address a conference called Armenians and the Left. What's left of the Armenians is still very vital and important. But kidding aside, I think it's an important issue because there is a reputation, at least in the United States, many of our brothers and sisters might be leaning somewhat toward the right in the camp of Ronald Reagan and Bush the First and Bush the Second. And I call these Armenians, the term is Hantes Armenians. Hantes is like a fete. It's a big ballroom where high rollers write $10,000 checks to governors and senatorial candidates and hope somehow to win favor from them on the issue that is most pressing to most Armenian Americans, and that is a recognition of the genocide issue. Well, one has to just examine the evidence after years and years of writing checks. What have we got? Well, there's a word in Yiddish, it's called bupkis, which is like the snot of the goat, not even human snot. So I think it's a failed strategy. Not only is it morally corrupt, supporting one of the most jingoist, xenophobic, bellicose regimes in recent U.S. history. That is the imperial regime that we're living under today. I was very glad to hear in the introduction last night to Mr. Fisk by Anthony Kasparian that he used the word imperialism. Because we live in a make-believe world in this country, a world of fantasies, and we are benevolent. Americans go out in the world helping people all over the world to, enjoy the benefits of the free market and the free press that we have here and all the other so-called freedoms. That's not the way it looks on the other side of the barrel. So when you look at the guns that are pointed at you, when the helicopter gunships are coming over, either flown by Israeli pilots or American pilots, people on the ground have a very different perspective. And I think it's much closer to the reality of what our country, if we can use that collective word, and I think we should, what our country has become over the last, several years indeed, with 9/11 becoming the breast-beating call to excuse any and all abridgments of civil rights and hard-earned freedoms for which supposedly bin Laden and Qaeda attacked America, because we are the beacon of freedom and democracy. Meanwhile, the Bush administration is doing everything to undermine freedom and democracy. And that's trickling right down here in this city when a play that was produced in London to great acclaim, My Name is Rachel Corrie, which was set to be produced and performed here in New York at a very prestigious venue, the New York Theater's Workshop, which has a tradition of presenting avant-garde progressive theater, canceled it because of pressure from outside sources. Now, what is this pressure? What is the atmosphere, in the country? What is the atmosphere in the country when the Petroleum Broadcasting Service, that means your PBS, note petroleum, because their biggest supporters come from ExxonMobil, Chevron, Texaco, British Petroleum, Shell, and all the rest. So it is a petroleum broadcasting service. They are to broadcast a documentary called The Armenian Genocide, produced by a non-Armenian, Andrew Goldberg. What was the position of PBS on this? They felt the need to present a panel, to present an alternative perspective with bogus scholars. You cannot call them scholars of any repute, people on the payroll of the Turkish government and or, Turks themselves. And they felt the need to put on this panel. Now, I just ask you, brothers and sisters, imagine if there was a PBS documentary on the Holocaust, let's say, and there have been many. Imagine if they had asked David Irving or Robert Farousson or some of the other notorious Holocaust deniers around the world to appear on a panel after it to say, well, you know, it could have been, there's no written order from Hitler, we're not exactly sure of the numbers, there seems to be some conflation and inflation of the facts. Can you imagine the uproar? I mean, it would be staggering in its impact. On slavery, imagine if a panel was convened to follow a documentary on slavery. Say, well, you know, they had a roof over their heads, they got meals every day, they had an address, you know, they had some place to call home. I mean, people would be outraged. Nevertheless, 91 years after the first Holocaust of the 20th century, these kind of shenanigans go on, which is simply morally, I think, depraved and shows you the corruption of the culture here. And let me not forget National Public Radio, because it's NPR's Scott Simon. We're now talking about the liberal left end of the media in the United States when we're talking about PBS and NPR. Scott Simon hosted this panel. And I would like to ask Scott Simon if he would ever consider hosting a panel with Farousson and Irving and other Holocaust deniers. So I think, you know, a lot of the issues that were brought up initially about Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, you know, has a lot to do with imperial cartography, the legacy of imperialism, which we are all living with today. From Iraq to Cyprus to Palestine to Ireland to the Caucasus. And, you know, these are important issues that we need to discuss. But I don't think we can depend on the U.S. corporate media, which has become an arm of imperialism. There's a very important moment in the brilliant documentary made by an Egyptian-American woman called Control Room. The senior Al Jazeera producer, Samir Khader, he says, you cannot wage a war without propaganda. And with propaganda, you need a media. And the Americans have the media. And he's spot on. The Americans have the media in order to carry out these campaigns of liberation and freedom and democracy.
I'd like to... I'd like to add just one comment to what David said, and that is that this cancer of denial of the Armenian Holocaust, which is what we call it in my newspaper, The Independent with a capital H, it spreads very much into Britain. The Imperial War Museum, which is our prime museum of British imperial history, particularly of the First and Second World Wars, carried a prominent exhibition a year ago on genocide, in which a whole panel was devoted to the Turkish denial of the Armenian Holocaust. And they got away with it all the way through, even though there were letters of complaint from people who went to the Imperial War Museum. No change was made. And when Tony Blair was initially asked to include Armenians in Holocaust Day Memorial, it was denied to the Armenians. And indeed, the BBC's, there was a Home Office, you'll be pleased to know, Race Equality Unit, which tells you a lot about Tony Blair's government. When he was Neil Frater of the Race Equality Unit, which was partly in charge of arranging Holocaust Day, was asked why the Armenians couldn't be included, he said that the atrocities were an appalling tragedy, and the British government extended its sympathies to the descendants of the victims. His unit, this is what he said, had asked the Holocaust Memorial Day Steering Group to consider the matter, but, quote, after full and careful consideration, which means take a look at the Turks, of course, after full and careful consideration had decided not to change their plans for the day. The steering group, Frater said, wanted to avoid the risk of the message becoming too diluted if we try to include too much history. The unit apparently was worried that people might want to bring the Crusades into it, as well as the Armenian genocide. So we have exactly the same problem in Britain over this little hurdle of actually saying it was a genocide and then ignoring the screams and shoutings of an outraged Turkish ambassador, which is regularly what happens when I do exactly the same thing and say the genocide actually happened.
I spent a couple of weeks in Turkey in late June and early July, and I want to share a few things with you about that because I found it very significant. First of all, Turkey, in one respect, is more democratic than the United States or the UK or Italy or Spain in terms of the war on Iraq. There, the government actually listened to the overwhelming majority of the Turkish population. In the 90 percentiles, I mean, it's hard to get anything in the 90 percentiles. Usually there's statistical error.
In Syria.
In Syria, you can get 99.9. But, you know, it was an extraordinary outpouring, and there the government, which is, you know, has basically been in the American pocket since the end of World War II, refused to allow the U.S. military to use the Turkish land area to invade Iraq from the north. And then you'll recall Wolfowitz.
Wolfowitz actually came in, didn't he? He said, well, don't the Turkish generals have something to say about this? Suddenly the Democrat had flipped across to becoming a militarist.
Yeah, and he said, you know, when America asks you something, you should listen and see what is in the best interest of the Americans. This is the way American diplomats, incidentally, talk when they come to Beirut. When I was there, David Satterfield came, and he's giving out little grades to the Lebanese. You get a B+ for this, a D- for that. You have to improve your behavior. That's how, you know, and Condoleezza Rice.
It's more than that. It's more than that.
More than that.
What the Americans did, I watched a previous version of this when Drejian, dare I say it, my favorite Armenian ambassador for the United States to Syria, he was brought in with another former American diplomat on a tour of the Middle East to try and convince Arabs that somehow public relations had got US foreign policy wrong. There was nothing wrong with US foreign policy towards Iraq, towards the Palestinians. What was wrong is that somehow they weren't getting the message correctly. The truth, of course, is that the Arabs have generally got the message all too accurately. But these guys kept saying, you know, I think you... And the funny thing was, as they were trying to explain US foreign policy, which is a difficult thing to do in the Middle East, they were aware of all the cameras popping, so they both had this extraordinary smile on their face, however awful the questions and what they were saying. And the whole thrust of it, it happened again in Cairo when they arrived there, was that it was just a PR problem. If only we could get across to you how benevolent the United States is, you wouldn't object to our invasion of Iraq and our one-sided attitude towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, etc., etc., etc. And it's amazing, this is exactly what the Israelis said after the 82 invasion of Lebanon turned to catastrophe, that it was a PR problem, that the media played a major role in not representing Israeli foreign policy correctly. They weren't showing what terrorists were doing. And over again we hear the same thing. You know, your whole 9/11 statement, David, is absolutely correct, and I made a few comments along the same lines last night. That, you know, you have to be persuaded that it has changed the world forever. And if you have a president of the United States who can convince you of that, then bin Laden has won. As I finished last night by saying that I will not let 19 Arab murderers change my world, and you shouldn't let it change yours. But I was very struck today when I was having lunch with a US reservist officer who's been in Iraq and before in Afghanistan, who said very eloquently to me, and I remember thinking, I must remember to say this afternoon to you, he said, those who believe that 9/11 changed the world were pissing in their pants with fear because America got attacked. What it means is, if you say the world has changed forever, it means I'm frightened. And that, I think, is the fear that has been played on outrageously and mendaciously by all our leaders, including my own dear Tony Blair, to, as you say, David, open the doors to massive restrictions of civil rights, civil liberties, and all those things which the United States was most prominent in standing up for and making the foundation of our new world at the end of the Second World War. You know, I was actually in the General Assembly of the United Nations when Bush made his September 12, 2002 what is the UN worth? Maybe it'll be going the same way as the League of Nations. And to remember that it was the United States which helped create the United Nations, the one construct that still exists internationally that can help to save us. To hear the successor to Truman and Roosevelt tearing apart the United Nations was the most extraordinary irony. And what was even more amazing is not a single American newspaper the next morning pointed this out. We had lived in the new age. We didn't have to remember history after the 11th of September, which was convenient because the 11th of September had a lot to do with history, which is one of the points I was trying to make out last night.
Well, we live in the USA, the United States of amnesia.
You live in the United States.
Yes. Well, we collectively. And many citizens suffer from national Alzheimer's disease, according to Studs Terkel. For example, the point about they're not getting the message right is the problem with U.S. imperialism. This is echoed many, many times. How many of you recall in the spring of 1990, after Saddam Hussein's worst atrocities, for which he's being held accountable for now, Halabja, the use of poison gas, chemical weapons, etc., on Iranian troops as well as Iraqi civilians, Kurds in the north, a senior senatorial delegation was dispatched by Bush the elder to Baghdad to meet with Saddam Hussein, the butcher of Baghdad, the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. And what was the message to Saddam Hussein from Robert Dole and Simpson of Colorado and these other great leaders?
I think your problem is with the press, Mr. President.
Yeah, exactly. He had a PR problem, Saddam Hussein. And you see this now, they appointed this hapless woman who doesn't speak a word of Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, or any Eastern language, being dispatched to capitals around the world. I'm speaking of Karen Hughes, because the neocons are convinced it is all about perception management. Now, that's a new Orwellian term that's in the discourse here now. Old-fashioned propaganda. You need to manage the perception. Never mind that the U.S. violated various international laws, including the UN Charter, including the U.S. War Powers Act of 1996. Never mind that every single member of this administration that was involved in the planning of that war is a war criminal and should be facing charges in The Hague. You can't talk about this on Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose wants to talk to Henry Kissinger and Fuad Ajami and Kanan Makia and talk about strategy. And did we get it right in Iraq? Do we have too few troops? Is that the problem? What about the supply lines? So it's all about tactics, and that becomes the discourse in the media. Did we get it right? Did we get it wrong? When the whole project is criminal from its inception. And no one is talking about this in the corporate media, and certainly in our failed political state, where we have Demopublicans and Republicrats, we have no representation there either.
There's this massive failure in the media regarding the Iraq War. The president got on the media and simply lied to the American people repeatedly. You know, the lies were weapons of mass destruction, the most obvious one. Then we were going to be welcomed with open arms. Then it was going to be a cakewalk. We wouldn't be there very long. And it was all going to be about promoting democracy in Iraq and the rest of the region. And the media simply dutifully reported this because they define their job as accurately reporting what the president says and not telling the American people, because they're not allowed to and they're not trained to, that it's not true. So the lies get through, people consume it, and then they build up this momentum that says, yeah, you know, go get them. And then only afterward reality sets in, and then it's too late.
Which is why only by reading Doonesbury will you find out what's going on in Iraq. I don't think Doonesbury's creator has ever been in the Middle East, but he got the invasion of Lebanon right in '82, and he got the 1991 Gulf War right. And my goodness me, you know, we all in Iraq read Doonesbury because it is the only accurate reflection we see in the press of what we're seeing on the streets of Baghdad. It's absolutely remarkable. It takes in everything from the you know, the whole contractors' corruption system of skimming off your tax money in Iraq, right down to the way in which the poor old soldiers are constantly being lied to. You know, if you've been following Doonesbury, we've gone through the weapons of mass destruction, the links between Saddam and Al-Qaeda and all the other myths. And the latest episode has a long discussion in the White House about, you know, what's the new posture going to be on Iraq. And Bush says, well, win the next elections for the Republicans. No, that won't go down too well. How about stop civil war? And the next scene is these poor soldiers dripping perspiration in the 30-degree Mesopotamian heat. I'm seeing an officer saying, all right, men, new mission. Stop civil war. Mount up. And this is how Doonesbury has accurately reflected what indeed is the new policy. We're led to believe, aren't we, that all the Sunnis and all the Shiites want to murder each other. Now, they never have wanted to do that before. There's never, ever been a civil war in the history of Iraq. I went to the funeral some time ago of a Sunni Muslim dentist doctor, who'd been murdered in his surgery, almost certainly by Shiite Muslim gunmen, because he'd objected to the building of a Husseiniya, a small Shiite mosque at the end of his street. And afterwards I was invited to the grisly business of the funeral feast, sitting on the floor with huge pieces of uncooked meat, next to the brother, of course the Sunni Muslim brother of the doctor. And I turned to him in my normal New York Times style and said, "So tell me, is there going to be civil war?" And he said, "Why do you Westerners all want us to have civil war?" He said, "We're not a sectarian society, we're a tribal society. We intermarry. My wife is a Shiite. Do you want me to kill my wife, Mr. Robert?" The funny thing is, and I think the civil war thing needs to be constantly investigated, the funny thing is that the first time I ever heard the word civil war came from the Occupation Forces spokesman in August of 2003 in the Green Zone during a press conference. And I remember noting down civil war, question mark, question mark, question mark. Who's talking about civil war? It was we who started talking about civil war in Iraq. The Iraqis did not. The Iraqis didn't understand what we were talking about. We were already, of course, chopping up with those nice little maps, Sunni Triangle, big Shiites, little Kurds up here. I mean, we don't do maps like that for you. We don't have, black areas of Washington, white, WASPs, Catholics, Jews. We don't chop America up like this unless we perhaps are planning a civil war, in which case, believe me, we will. But there is a big problem here, the way we go into Arab countries and chop them up and put colour schemes. I remember being asked by the Times of London during the Lebanese Civil War, would I like to do a colour-coded scheme of the various religions at war with each other in Lebanon? Goodness me, I had the Druze at the top, in the middle, at the bottom. Of course, we didn't run it in the end. It was far too complicated and it didn't represent reality. But, this is a major problem now in reporting Iraq, is this constant, will there be a civil war? We might be near civil war. Sometimes I think that we want to threaten the Iraqis into obedience by worrying them with the idea of civil war. I mean, we keep hearing about, men in police uniform have kidnapped Margaret Hassan, for example, of Care, who was so brutally murdered in front of a video camera. Then we hear that men in military uniform have taken over a barracks or a police station. Now, don't tell me that there is a warehouse in Fallujah with 8,000 police uniforms and a guy measuring each insurgent for his police uniform. There is not. We had exactly the same problem in Algeria when we had what were called faux barrages, false checkpoints, manned by men in police uniforms. And it took us about 3 months before we realised that they were policemen. And sometime at about 10 past 6 in the evening, they stopped being policemen and became insurgents. And exactly what is happening now in Iraq is that the insurgents have totally infiltrated the security forces, whose growing success rate is going to allow your American army to leave. The insurgents are inside the military and the police. I went off on an awful day with the Iraqi police. My suggestion, of course, please, Minister of Interior, can I go out with the Iraqi police today? And it was interesting to see throughout the day how the policemen I was with became more and more pro-insurgency. They started talking about terrorists, and at the end of the day they were talking about the holy warriors. And I realised that they were already metamorphosing, like the false checkpoints in Algeria. They were becoming the insurgents. And their initial complaints, please would I tell the Americans they didn't have enough weapons, ended up by saying, well, thank goodness they gave us some to shoot at the right people. And it was about 10 past 4, and I thought, it's about time, they're about to metamorphose, and I got my driver to come and pick me up. So there's a whole series. Someone in Iraq wants a civil war. Somebody does, but I don't believe that all the Sunnis are going around blowing up all the Shiite mosques and all the Shiites are going around burning down the Sunni mosques. It is not credible. This is this lovely word, the French have a phrase, infantilisme. It's babyishness to believe this. It is much more complex and more sinister than that. There are death squads operating in Iraq. Some of those death squads are working for government ministries. Who pays these government ministries? Who pays the civil servants? Who's supplying the weapons to the death squads?
And the U.S. is building... the U.S. is building 14 permanent bases in Iraq at costs of hundreds of millions of dollars. But I want to cross the border again back into Turkey because it's a seismically active country, terrain, and I think there are the tectonic plates are moving there, if I could use an overused cliche for a moment. Another example that I think is significant is the World Tribunal on Iraq. Now, I know you all heard about it here on the corporate media. You were probably inundated with reports. On 3 days of sessions, it wasn't reported at all, I'm being totally facetious, there was a complete blackout here in the media of, I think, a very significant event involving people from all over the world. For example, Arundhati Roy of India was there on the jury, Chandra Muzaffar from Malaysia, Eve Ensler from the United States, Hans von Sponek, Dennis Halliday, former Undersecretary Generals of the UN, numerous Iraqis, Turks, people from all over the Middle East. And this was held in the ruins of the Imperial Mint in Topkapı, in the great Ottoman palace on the Bosphorus. Very significant in terms of its background, because the mint is crumbling. And here we were all covering, the decline and fall of the American empire as seen from this perspective. And so there is no way that a conference of this significance could have been held without the okay of the Turkish government. So they're feeling confident enough now to go up against the Americans. They did it in refusing to join the war party, and they did it again by holding this conference, which then did give its verdict after 3 days of deliberation, listening, and this was the 20th of a series of world tribunals on Iraq. And Mr. Blair, Mr. Bush, Mr. Berlusconi, Mr. Howard of Australia, and the other great leaders of the Grand Coalition were all found guilty of international war crimes. But that was kind of expected. But what was interesting, Robert, in their verdict was they also found the media guilty. They found Judith Miller and the New York Times guilty of passing on false information from Ahmed Chalabi and Curveball and Screwball and Fastball and these other, mythical Iraqi agents out there that are supposedly feeding Judith Miller secret information about weapons of mass destruction. So from Istanbul, then I went to Diyarbakir, and every Kurd I met told me this place is going to blow. This place is going to explode, and you're seeing that again. There was some attacks on trains and police stations when I was there in July that were barely reported here, and now that is, I think, increasing and is going to expand. The Kurds in Diyarbakir, which is the unofficial capital of Kurdistan, they are looking to Erbil. They are looking to Kirkuk. They are looking to Soleimania. They are looking south. What is happening in Iraqi Kurdistan? And so it's a very volatile situation. Maybe you have more information about the Kurds in Iraq.
Well, I want to say, first of all, I felt this particularly in the Bertrand Russell Tribunal, so-called, that followed the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in '82. I have grave reservations about these tribunals and naming people guilty of war crimes. There are enough farcical tribunals already in the world. One of them is trying Saddam, which has turned into a complete theatre, as I'm sure you realize. I think that there's a certain off-putting quality about these tribunals in which the usual suspects are said to be war criminals, and plus the media or whatever else. I'm not sure. I think it's very comforting for those participating in the tribunals, but I don't think it actually convinces anyone outside. I think one of the great problems at the moment in this country, and to some extent in Britain, is that the left, and I don't call myself a leftist or anything else, I've never voted in my life for anybody, but I think one of the great problems is that those who feel, correctly in my view, that there is a massive distance occurred, a great chasm in the democratic process between what we know as decent people to be the right thing to do and the actions we see our representative take, which appear to us to be, in my view correctly, immoral, is that there is no mechanism with which we can actually adjust this. We can have as many Bertrand Russell tribunals and tribunals in crumbling mints in Topkapi as we want. I don't think that message, it doesn't matter even if the New York Times gave it 8 columns, I don't think it's going to influence people. And I ask myself how one can influence people? And I ask it very simply because, my job as a journalist on the ground in the Middle East is to try and get the reality out, which I try to do in the reports I file, and which, thank God, I've got a brave editor who prints them. But I'm not sure where it goes from there. And I don't think that just amassing newspaper reports saying we're guilty or not guilty and Blair is a war criminal actually achieves anything. I say this particularly because when I was launching the French edition of my book, I was doing an interview with, I think it was TV5, and, well, in English, it was in French, but he said, what do you think you've achieved as a journalist in the Middle East? And I paused for a long time and I said, nothing. I don't think we did anything. I don't think anything followed. I can think of one story only, the attack on Qana in 1996, where I think politically things got changed by one story I wrote. But I find that there's a disconnection between, for example, this is a very personal statement, me on the ground finding something out and putting it out there into print or on the screen or whatever, in my hated internet, which is what you read if you read the Internet Independent. And then there's a sort of gap because nothing actually is achieved by revealing something like this. Nothing goes forward. And I wonder sometimes whether the left, quote unquote, with a capital L, isn't using tactics that have become a little outdated. I think that, in a strange way, just as McCarthyism has the ghost of McCarthy now haunts those journalists who fear to be slandered with the phrase anti-Semitism if they criticize Israel, so I think the left has become haunted by Vietnam and is not responding in a modern way to the enormous threats which face our freedoms today. And the mere fact that I'd heard of this tribunal in Turkey, and it was reported in the Middle East, and each time I came to it, my eyes skidded off it, because I thought, here's another one of these bogus mock trials in which everyone puts on funny wigs and says Tony Blair is going to be a war criminal, or George Bush, and we used to say that Reagan was, and then we said before that George Bush Sr. was, and before that, remember that, of course, we had the Johnson was, and Nixon was, and so on and so forth. I just wonder whether the left responds maturely enough. And I'm asking this as a question, I'm not necessarily making it as a terrible criticism, to the threats which actually do confront us today, and which confront me as a journalist and you as ordinary citizens, most of you in the United States. And I don't know if the way you handle this is up to date enough. I was at a seminar at George Mason University in 2002, in which I was asked to come and listen to academics' concerns about not getting their point of view over. I wouldn't say they were all leftists, but they certainly were liberal people, with lowercase l. And the conversation started by people saying, well, we want to get our point of view across into the mainstream press, and I've sent 17 emails to the New York Times. To which my reaction was, you're wasting your time. You're not going to get your point of view over in the, quote, mainstream press, and stop calling it mainstream. Start calling it alternative and call your newspapers mainstream. I noticed the fact in which, over and over again, academics want to talk and network with other academics. And I said to these people, the people you should be trying to influence are the crews on the Amtrak trains and the truck drivers going down the turnpikes, because these are the people who need the money for an education and go and join the Marines and get sent to Iraq. When I give lectures in the United States, I always try and get the bellhops at my hotel, the security guards at LaGuardia or JFK, the crews of my aeroplanes, and I get them in. They come to the lectures. I had a whole Aer Lingus crew came the other day to the Columbia School of Journalism, and they bought my book. I don't think that's going to influence Irish politics on the Middle East, but nonetheless, I try, in my small way, to get ordinary people, not just academics, talking to academics. And, when I began to hear the list of the usual suspects, and I knew David would be one of them, turning up in Istanbul, I thought, here we go again. Can we not invite lots and lots of ordinary Americans who have horrible jobs and don't get paid enough, and pay their airfares to go and see and listen to this themselves, so they'll talk about it? I don't mean to say you're not ordinary Americans, but I do feel there's a complete detachment between the left in Britain, not so much in Britain, but it still exists, and certainly the left, the intellectual left in America, and the people they should be addressing, who are the poorer Americans, particularly the black Americans, who end up going off to fight and die in Iraq. And I see them fighting and dying there.
This
David,
is
yes.
called product placement in corporate media. I actually have 4-set DVDs back there of the World Tribunal on Iraq, so maybe you can pick it up and decide for yourself. I think these exercises, and it is a form of an exercise, are morally important. They do have intrinsic moral value for people standing up and saying, we condemn this action. It may or may not have an effect. It certainly had an effect on everyone that was there. I can tell you of the tens of thousands of ordinary Turks that were present, they were quite impressed. Not to mention other, Jordanians, Lebanese, etc., that were there. As much as we condemn, and I condemn the corporate media, Ben Bagdikian, incidentally, since we are in an Armenian forum, did the landmark work on this in 1982. He wrote a book called The Media Monopoly, which is like the Bible of corporate concentration and control. At that time, he identified 50 corporations controlling most of the media in the United States. I'm going to speak very fast like Amy Goodman. In subsequent editions, 2, 3, it went down to 28, 23, 14, 10, 6, and now the current is down to 5. So pretty soon it'll be down to 1, which will make our job very easy, I think. Then there won't be any pretense of competitive media or, you have all these choices out there. At the same time this is happening during the 80s, there's a parallel movement, a counter movement, where people like us, I'll say, myself, Amy Goodman, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Deep Dish TV, which is here filming today, and other groups, Free Speech TV in Boulder, we started our own organizations where we told the stories, where we controlled the microphones and the cameras, and we don't have the audiences of ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, and Fox and all the rest, but nevertheless this is a growing movement, and I agree with you. We shouldn't be calling ourselves alternative. We are the mainstream. They are, the imperial media that, this is the kind of journalism you have now in the United States, where they take press releases from the Pentagon and the White House and they rewrite a few of the verbs and change some of the pronouns and say, this is the news, as reported from Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and George Bush. So that's going on, but there's also some good news in terms of our building a network here. Community radio in the United States is extraordinary. I don't know of another country in the world that has such a network of independent community-based radio stations where you can hear Robert's voice on a regular basis, where you can hear Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and Tariq Ali and so many other voices that are completely blocked out from the corporate media. So yes, comrades, things are bad, but they're not as bad as you think, and we're going to make them better with your help.
Robert, I'd like to ask a question concerning the Vietnam War. One of the underpublicized but very important sources of pressure that led to the ending of that war was resistance within the military. We had over 500,000 desertions. We had attacks on non-commissioned and commissioned officers by enlisted men and draftees. We even had numerous cases of sabotage of aircraft carriers which were unable to leave ports in San Diego and San Francisco to be dispatched to Vietnam to carry on the air war that Nixon administered. And do you see any evidence of military resistance among the troops in Iraq? Is that present? Is it growing?
No, absolutely not. This is volunteer army, whether you feel you volunteered to go to Iraq or not. I haven't seen any. I've come across what I think is clear evidence of local ceasefires negotiated by junior officers with people whom they obviously believe are family members of people who are in the insurgency, along the lines of, if you don't fire any mortars at us, we won't run a patrol down the main street tomorrow morning. For example, the British in Amara, they claim to control Amara. They have a deal with all the local tribesmen that they will run one armoured patrol through the centre of the city every afternoon at about 3 o'clock. And then they go back to their base and close the doors and eat their MREs, and that's the end of that. Nobody shoots at them. So to the extent that you've got junior officers trying to keep their men alive and come back with all their men in the same aeroplane alive, not in coffins, if that's resistance to the war, it clearly does exist in a small scale. But if you're talking of, apart from certain well-known incidents where soldiers who thought they were Muslims tried to kill, I think we had a case in Kuwait at one point, tried to kill an officer or did kill an officer, I've seen no evidence at all of the form of mutiny, which is what you're talking about, or sabotage. No, absolutely not. I haven't. And even those soldiers I've talked to, well, I talked to them here, of course, but even those soldiers I've talked to, serving in Iraq in uniform, however bitter their condemnation of both the administration and the prosecution of the war may be, and it is very bitter, I've not heard from them in any way any suggestion of the kind of thing that we or you saw in Vietnam, of killing officers, threatening officers, refusing to go on patrols. Certainly we had an incident actually during the invasion of Iraq when a general refused to send his troops forward because he thought they'd come under too great an attack from the Iraqi army, and he in fact was relieved of his command because he left a military flank exposed during the entry into Iraq from Kuwait by US forces. But again, that wasn't a form of mutiny. It was just a soldier who decided on his own bat he wanted to make sure he brought all his men home. So no, I don't see any evidence of the Vietnam behaviour at all. Absolutely not. I think maybe you should ask the audience for some comments.
We did have a question in the back a while ago. Is that gentleman still here? Yeah.